about 1 in 3 Americans takes a multivitamin. Is that helpful, harmful, or just harmless, a waste of money? In 2011, the Iowa Women's Health Study reported that multivitamin use was associated with a higher risk of total mortality, meaning in effect women who took a multivitamin appeared to be paying to live shorter lives. But this was an observational study, meaning they didn't split them up into 2 groups, put half on a multivitamin, and see who lived longer. They just followed a large population of women over time, and found that those who happened to be taking multivitamins were more likely to die. But maybe they were taking multivitamins because they were sick? The researchers didn't find any evidence of that, but ideally what we'd have is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. Thousands of people followed for over a decade, half given a multivitamin, half a placebo, and see what happens. And that's what we got the following year, in 2012, the Harvard Physician Study 2. And after a decade, no effect on heart attack, stroke, or mortality. The accompanying editorial concluded that multivitamins are a distraction from effective cardiovascular disease prevention. The message needs to remain simple and focused. Heart disease can be largely prevented by healthy lifestyle changes. They did, however, find that for men with a history of cancer, the multivitamin appeared to be protective against getting cancer again, though there was no significant difference in cancer mortality or cancer protection in those who've never had cancer before. Still, though, that's pretty exciting. It is just one study, though. Ideally, we'd have like 20 of these placebo-controlled trials, and then compile all the results together, and that's what we got in 2013, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, 21 of them, covering more than 90,000 individuals, and no influence on mortality either way. Some found more cancer mortality, some found less cancer mortality, but all in all, it was a wash. And that was heralded as good news. After the Iowa Women's Health Study came out, we were worried multivitamins could be harming millions of people. But instead, they don't appear to have much effect either way. The accompanying editorial asked, should meta-analyses trump observational studies? Iowa Women's Health Study followed tens of thousands of women for nearly 20 years. Well, what if we put all the studies together, the big observational studies along with the experimental trials? And that's what we got in December 2013, concluding that multivitamins appear to offer no consistent evidence of benefit for heart disease, cancer, or living longer. Why, though? Aren't vitamins and minerals good for us? Well, one explanation for this result could be that our bodies are so complex that the effects of supplementing a few components is generally ineffective or actually does harm. Maybe we should get our nutrients in the way nature intended. The accompanying editorial concluded enough is enough. We should stop wasting our money on vitamin and mineral supplements. Americans spend billions on such supplements. A better investment in health would be eating more fruits and vegetables. Imagine if we instead spent those billions on healthy food. This is not the aisle we should be getting our nutrients from. With the money we save on pills, we can buy more of the best multivitamins on Earth. Are purported benefits of fish oil supplementation for the prevention and treatment of heart disease just a fishtail? Thanks to recommendations like this from the American Heart Association, that individuals at high risk for heart disease ask their physicians about fish oil supplementation, it's grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. We now consume over 100,000 tons of fish oil every year. But what does the latest science say? A systematic review and meta-analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at all the best randomized clinical trials evaluating the effects of omega-3s on lifespan, cardiac death, sudden death, heart attack, and stroke, either advice to eat more oily fish or to take fish oil capsules. What did they find? Overall, they found no protective benefit for overall mortality, heart disease mortality, sudden cardiac death, heart attack, or stroke. What about for those who've already had a heart attack, though, and are trying to prevent another one? Still no benefit. Where did we even get this idea that omega-3s were good for the heart? Well, if you look at some of the older studies, the results looked promising. For example, the famous DART trial back in the 80s involving 2,000 men. Those advised to eat fatty fish had a 29% reduction in mortality. Pretty impressive. No wonder it got a lot of attention. But people seem to have forgotten about the sequel, the DART-2 trial. Same group of researchers, an even bigger study, 3,000 men, and those advised to eat oily fish, and particularly those supplied with fish oil capsules, had a higher risk of cardiac death. Put all the studies together, and there's no justification for the use of omega-3s as a structured intervention in everyday clinical practice, or for guidelines supporting more dietary omega-3s. So what should doctors say when their patients follow the American Heart Association advice to ask them about fish oil supplements? Well, given the new meta-analysis and other negative meta-analyses, our job as doctors should be to stop highly marketed fish oil supplementation in all of our patients. Although the most serious causes of food poisoning, like salmonella, come mostly from animal products, for example, most foodborne-related deaths were attributed to poultry, millions of Americans are sickened by produce every year thanks to noroviruses. Noroviruses can be spread person to person via the fecal-oral route, or the ingestion of aerosolized vomit, which may explain most norovirus food outbreaks, but a substantial proportion remain unexplained. How else could fecal viruses get on our fruits and veggies? The pesticide industry may be spraying them on. The water that's used to spray pesticides on crops may just be dredged up from ponds contaminated with fecal pathogens. The application of pesticides may therefore not only be a chemical hazard, but also a microbiological hazard for public health. So what's their solution? Add more chemicals. The inclusion of antiviral substances in reconstituted pesticides may be appropriate to reduce the virological health risk posed by the application of pesticides. Or we could just choose organic. Either way, though, we should always wash all fruits and veggies under running water, as one solution to pollution is dilution. Salmonella causes more hospitalizations than any other foodborne illness, more deaths than any other foodborne illness, and it's on the rise. Salmonella causes 1 million cases of food poisoning every year in the U.S., and over the last decade or so, the number of cases have increased by 44%, particularly among children and the elderly. And chicken is the #1 cause. From spring 2012 to spring 2013, the Centers for Disease Control reported over 100 individuals infected across 13 states with a particularly virulent strain of Salmonella. 1 in 3 were hospitalized. Investigations pointed to Foster Farms brand chicken as the most likely cause of the outbreak, the 6th largest chicken producer in the U.S. The CDC warned people, but nothing was done. Foster Farms apparently continued to pump out contaminated meat. In October, the CDC reported outbreaks expanded to 21 states. Though there's only been a few hundred cases confirmed, for every confirmed case, the CDC estimates 38 cases slipped through the cracks. So that means Foster Farms chicken may have infected and sickened over 10,000 people. When USDA inspectors went in to investigate, they found 25% of the chicken they sampled was contaminated with the outbreak strain of Salmonella, likely because of all the fecal matter they found on the carcasses. Consumer Reports, in their February 2014 issue, published a study they did on the high cost of cheap chicken in general, finding 97% of retail chicken breasts off store shelves were contaminated with bacteria that could make people sick. 38% of the Salmonella they found was resistant to multiple antibiotics, considered a serious public health threat by the CDC. Consumer Reports suggested the cramped conditions on factory chicken farms may be playing a role, and indeed new research shows the stress of overcrowding can increase Salmonella invasion. The Pew Commission released a special report on the Foster Farms outbreaks, concluding that the outbreaks bring into sharp focus the ineffectiveness of USDA's approach to minimizing salmonella contamination in poultry products. The agency's response was inadequate to protect public health, and to this day thousands of people are getting sick with these preventable foodborne illnesses. Among their radical recommendations, close facilities that are failing to produce safe food and keep them closed until their products stop sending people to the hospital. What a concept. What did Foster Farms have to say for itself? They said their chicken was safe to eat. There's still no recall in effect, and that it is grade A wholesome. In the same breath, though, they say salmonella on chicken happens all the time. Grade A wholesome, but might kill us if we don't handle it right. As outspoken food safety advocate Bill Marler put it, the poultry industry's reaction to the presence of fecal contamination on chicken is that it happens. Mexico banned the importation of Foster Farms chicken on public health grounds, but it's still sold in the United States. Why wasn't there a recall? How could they continue to legally sell chicken contaminated with a virulent strain of salmonella? It all goes back to Supreme Beef versus USDA, a court case in which the meat industry sued the USDA after the agency had the audacity to try to shut down a slaughter plant that was repeatedly found violating salmonella standards. The meat industry won. The Federal Appeals Court ruled that it was not illegal to sell contaminated meat. In fact, what was illegal was the USDA trying to protect the public by shutting down the plant. Because normal cooking practices destroy salmonella, the presence of salmonella in meat products does not render them injurious to health. Salmonella-infected meat is thus legal to sell to the consumer. But even though consumers can eliminate salmonella in chicken by proper cooking, we can still be exposed to and acquire a salmonella infection from cross-contamination with salmonella from raw chicken during meal preparation. If you measure the transfer rate from naturally contaminated poultry legs purchased in supermarkets to cutting boards in the kitchen, overall 80% of the leg skins in contact with the cutting board for 10 minutes transferred Campylobacter infection to the cutting board. That's another food poisoning bacteria found in chicken feces. And then if you put cooked chicken back on the same cutting board, there's about a 30% chance it'll become recontaminated. Even though people know that washing hands can decrease the risk of food poisoning, only about 2/3 say they actually do it. Even though most people know about cross-contamination, a third don't even report washing their cutting boards. Though awareness appears to be growing, as we saw before, even when people wash the cutting boards with hot soapy water, you can still find salmonella and Campylobacter. The reason most people have more bacteria from feces in their kitchen than in their bathroom is because people rinse their chickens in the sink, not the toilet. So even though cooking can kill salmonella, it can still contaminate our kitchen and make us sick. Foster Farms swore they'd try to reduce the number of chickens they were producing with salmonella from 1 in 4 down to just 1 in 20. Why not zero tolerance like they have in countries like Sweden? Because then, as the head of food safety for Costco noted, you wouldn't have a poultry industry. Other countries have been able to raise chickens without salmonella, though. But as one industry-funded scientist explained, if the entire onus to produce safe products is placed on industry, then it gives the consumer no personal responsibility to handle their product correctly. What? That's like a car company saying, we can't make safe cars because then no one will wear a seatbelt. November 2013, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration announced their plans to all but eliminate trans fats from processed foods, citing a CDC statistic that the elimination of partially hydrogenated oils from the food supply could prevent more than 10,000 heart attacks and thousands of deaths every year. Currently, trans fats enjoy so-called GRAS status, generally recognized as safe. How did these killer fats get labeled as safe? Who gets to determine that? Currently, a generally recognized as safe determination is made when the manufacturer of a food substance evaluates the safety of the substance themselves and concludes that the use of the substance is safe. Did I just read that right? The company that manufactures the substance gets to determine if it's safe or not? This approach is commonly referred to as grass self-determination. To make matters worse, not only do they not have to inform the public, they don't even have to inform the FDA. In a footnote, they explain that a company may voluntarily tell the FDA they just came up with a new food additive that they decided is safe, but are not required to even do that. The cumulative result is that there is an estimated 6,000 current affirmative safety decisions, which allow for more than an estimated 10,000 substances to be used in food. In addition, an estimated 1,000 manufacturer safety decisions are never reported to the FDA or the public. Manufacturers and the trade association made the remaining decisions without FDA review by concluding on their own that the substances that they themselves are selling were safe. While manufacturers are not required to notify the FDA of a quote-unquote safe determination, sometimes they do notify the agency with a little FYI. At least in those cases where they're going public with their decision as to what they're putting in our food, presumably they're being above board and finding some independent third-party panel. The objective of this study was to find out. Of the 451 GRAS notifications voluntarily submitted to the FDA, 22% were made by someone directly employed by the company. 13% were made by someone directly employed by a firm handpicked by the company, and 64% by a panel handpicked by the corporation or the firm the corporation hired. Are you doing the math? Yes, that means 0% of safety decisions were made independently. An astonishing 100% of the members of expert panels worked directly or indirectly for the companies that manufactured the food additive in question, 100%. And those were just the ones the food companies told FDA about. And they used the same rent-a-scientist experts over and over, leading food industry watchdog Marion Nestle to ask, how is it possible that the FDA permits manufacturers to decide for themselves whether their food additives are safe? Maybe it's because many of the companies providing our daily food are corporate giants with political muscles national governments would envy. PepsiCo alone spent more than $9 million in a single year to lobby Congress. The fact that food additives like trans fats have been allowed to kill thousands of Americans year after year comes as less of a surprise to those who realize 3 of Washington's largest lobbying firms reportedly now work for the food industry. Right now, almost 2/3 of Americans are overweight, and by 2030, more than half our population may be clinically obese. Childhood obesity has tripled, and most of them will grow up to be overweight as well. The United States may be in the midst of raising the first generation since our nation's founding that will have a shorter predicted lifespan than that of the previous generation. The food industry blames inactivity. We just need to move more. But what is the role of exercise in the treatment of obesity? There is considerable debate in the medical literature today about whether physical activity has any role whatsoever in the epidemic of obesity that's swept the globe since the 80s. The increase in calories per person is more than sufficient to explain the U.S. epidemic of obesity. In fact, if anything, the level of physical activity over the last few decades has actually gone up in both Europe and North America. This has important policy implications. Yes, we still need to exercise more, but the priorities for reversing the obesity epidemic should focus on the overconsumption of calories. To work off the increased caloric intake, which for kids is like an extra can of soda and small fries, compared to what they were eating back in the 70s, and for adults, like an extra Big Mac a day, to work that off, you'd have to walk like 2 hours a day, 7 days a week. So exercise can prevent weight gain, but the amount required to prevent weight gain may be closer to twice the current recommendations. Public health advocates have been experimenting with including this kind of information. The fast food menu labeled with calories and the number of miles to walk to burn those calories appeared to be most effective in influencing the selection of lower-calorie meals. Now, exercise alone may have a small effect, and that small effect can make a big difference on a population scale. A 1% decrease in BMI nationwide might prevent millions of cases of diabetes and heart disease, thousands of cases of cancer. But why don't we lose more weight from exercise? Maybe because we're just not doing it enough. I mean, the small magnitude of weight loss observed from the majority of exercise interventions, where they make people exercise, may be primarily due to how low the doses are of the prescribed exercise. People tend to overestimate how many calories are burned by physical activity. For example, there's this myth that a bout of sexual activity burns a few hundred calories. So hey, you could get a side of fries with that. But if you actually hook people up and measure energy expenditure during the act, and your study subjects don't get too tangled up with all the wires and hoses, though it may be nearly the metabolic equivalent of calisthenics, given that the average bout of sexual activity only lasts about 6 minutes, a young man might expend approximately 21 calories during sexual intercourse. Of course, he would have spent roughly one-third that just lying around watching TV, just basal metabolism. So the incremental benefit is plausibly on the order of 14 calories. So maybe we could have like one fry with that. The American Egg Board is a promotional marketing board appointed by the U.S. government, whose mission is to increase demand for egg and egg products on behalf of U.S. egg producers. Now, if an individual egg company wants to run an ad campaign, they can say whatever they want. But if an egg corporation wants to dip into the $10 million the American Egg Board sets aside for advertising, because the board is overseen by the federal government, corporations are not allowed to lie with those funds. What a concept. Which leads to quite revealing exchanges between egg corporations that want to use that money and USDA on what egg companies can and cannot say about eggs. Thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get my hands on some of those emails. Of course, a lot of what I got looked like this. Please note a number of items about our Salmonella Crisis module. Any questions? Or even better, entire sheets of paper that literally just said this. That was the whole sheet of paper. Our tax dollars hard at work. But check this out. This is some egg company trying to put out a brochure on healthy snacking for kids. But because of existing laws against false and misleading advertising, the head of USDA's Poultry Research and Promotion Programs reminds them that you can't couch eggs or egg products as being healthy or nutritious. See, the words nutritious and healthy carry certain connotations. You know that food is actually good for you. But because eggs have the amount of cholesterol they do, plus all the saturated fat, the words healthy and nutritious are problematic when it comes to eggs. This is the USDA saying this. However, the USDA helpfully suggests you can say eggs are nutrient-dense. Wait a second, why can you say eggs are nutrient-dense but not nutritious? Because there's no legal definition of nutrient-dense. You can say Twinkies and Coca-Cola are nutrient-dense, but legally, you can't say something is nutritious unless it's actually nutritious. So for example, the egg industry wanted to run this ad calling eggs a nutritional powerhouse that aids in weight loss. The USDA had to remind the industry you can't portray eggs as a diet food because of the fat and cholesterol content. In fact, they have nearly twice the calories of anything that can be called low-calorie. Nutritional powerhouse can't be used either. Fine, the industry said, they'll move to Plan B, and headline the ad, Exceptional Nutrition. Nope, because again, given the saturated fat and cholesterol, you can't legally call eggs nutritious. So the ad ended up Find True Satisfaction, and instead of weight loss, they had to go with Can Reduce Hunger. USDA congratulated them on their cleverness. Yes, a food that when eaten can reduce hunger. What a concept. You can't even call eggs a food relatively low in calories. Can't say eggs are low in saturated fat. They're not. Can't say they're relatively low in fat. Can't even call them a rich source of protein because they're not. It's illegal to advertise that eggs pack a nutritional wallop. Can't truthfully say that. Or have a high nutritional content. You can't say eggs are nutritious eggs at all. Can't say nutritious. Cannot say eggs are nutritious. Sometimes you have to tell the industry a few times. Eggs have so much cholesterol you can't even say they contribute nutritionally. Can't say eggs are healthful. Certainly can't say they're healthy. Have you seen how much cholesterol there are in those things? Can't say healthy. Can't even say eggs contribute healthful components. Since you can't say eggs are a healthy start to the day, the USDA suggests satisfying start. Can't call eggs a healthful ingredient, but you can call eggs a recognizable ingredient. Can't truthfully say eggs are good for you, can't say they're good for you. By law, the egg industry needs to steer clear of words like healthy or nutritious. For food to be labeled healthy under FDA rules, it has to be low in saturated fat. Eggs fail that test, and less than 90 milligrams of cholesterol per serving. Even half an egg fails that criteria. For the same reason you can't tout ice cream for healthy bones, you can't say eggs are healthy, because they exceed the limit for cholesterol. Egg corporations aren't even allowed to say things like, eggs are an important part of a well-balanced, healthy diet on an egg carton, because it would be considered misleading, according to the USDA's National Egg Supervisor, since eggs contain significant amounts of fat and cholesterol, and therefore contribute to the leading killer in the United States, heart disease. The industry can't afford to tell the truth about eggs, or even the hens that lay them. The industry crams 5 to 10 birds in cages the size of a file cabinet their whole lives, but when providing footage to the media, the American Egg Board instructs, do not show multiple birds in cages, they look too crowded and open us up to activist criticism. In other words, do not show the truth. Not only is the industry barred from saying eggs are healthy, they can't even refer to eggs as safe. All references to safety must be removed, because more than 100,000 Americans are salmonella poisoned every year from eggs. The Egg Board response to this egg-borne epidemic is that salmonella is a naturally occurring bacteria. The egg industry didn't think that should necessarily be the key message, fearing it may be counterproductive by implying there's no avoiding salmonella in eggs aside from avoiding eggs altogether. That's why the American Egg Board can't even mention anything but eggs cooked hard and dry. No soft-boiled, no over-easy, no sunny side up, because of salmonella. The American Egg Board's own research showed that the sunny side up cooking method should be considered unsafe. And because of avian influenza as well, not just salmonella, in light of bird flu viruses, eggs must be cooked firm. The VP of Marketing for the Egg Board complained to the USDA, saying they'd really like to not have to dictate that yolks are firm. What about some Washington Post article saying running yolks may be safe for everyone except pregnant women, infants, elderly, or those with chronic disease? Turns out that was a misquote. They can't be considered safe for anyone. Instead of safe, you can call eggs fresh, the USDA Marketing Service helpfully suggests, but you can't call eggs safe. You cannot say eggs are safe to eat, can't say they're safe, can't even mention safety, can't say they're healthful. All references to healthfulness must be deleted as well. Wait a second. Eggs can't really be called healthy? Eggs can't even really be called safe? Says who? Says the United States Department of Agriculture. Aromatherapy is the use of concentrated essential oils extracted from plants to treat disease, and is commonly used to treat anxiety symptoms. Anxiety disorders are the most prevalent class of psychiatric disorders in the general population. However, their treatment is still challenging, as the drugs used for the relief of anxiety symptoms can have important side effects. Thankfully, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trials performed to evaluate the effects of essential oils on anxiety symptoms are gradually starting to appear in the medical literature. However, in most of these studies, exposure to the essential oil odor was accompanied by massage. This makes it difficult to draw firm conclusions about the effect of the aroma itself. Here's a typical example. Patients in the intensive care unit the day after open-heart surgery getting foot massages with orange-scented oil. Why not back massages? Because they just had their chests cracked open, so have this huge sternotomy wound. Maybe a preventive plant-based diet rather than a post-op plant-based massage might have been the better choice. But the massages felt great, restful, peaceful, calming. It's a British study because one described the effect as smashing. But how do we know the essential oil had anything to do with it? Maybe it was just the massage that was so bloody good. In which case, great, let's give people massages. I'm all for more ICU foot rubs. There's considerable evidence from randomized trials that massage alone reduces anxiety. So if massage is effective, then aromatherapy plus massage is also effective. So aromatherapy may work even if it doesn't. In fact, one study where cancer patients got massaged during chemo and radiation even found that the massage without the fragrance may be better. They thought it might be like a negative Pavlovian response. People smell the citrus in their bodies like, oh no, another cancer treatment. More recently, the ambient odor of orange was tested in a dentist's office to see if it reduces anxiety and improves mood. Ambient odor of orange was diffused into the waiting room. It appeared to have a relaxant effect, less anxiety, better mood, and calmness compared to the control group where there was no odor in the air. No odor, that is, except the nasty dentist office smell. Right? Maybe the orange scent was just masking the unpleasant odors. Maybe it had nothing to do with any kind of orange-specific molecules. More research was necessary. The effect of sweet orange aroma on experimental anxiety in humans. They exposed some grad students to an anxiety-producing situation and tested the scent of orange versus a non-orange aroma versus no scent at all. And the orange did appear to have an anxiety-reducing effect. Interestingly, the observed anxiety-reducing effects was not followed by physical or mental sedation. On the contrary, at the highest dose, the orange oil made the volunteers feel more energetic, so potentially less anxiety without the downer effect of Valium-type drugs. Does that mean we can get the benefits without the side effects? Well, I've talked about the concerns about using scented consumer products, even ones based on natural fragrances. And there have been reports of adverse effects of aromatherapy, in fact, some pretty serious reactions. Alternative medicine isn't necessarily risk-free. Like there's dozens of reported cases of people having their hearts ruptured by acupuncture. Ouch. But the adverse effects of aromatherapy were mostly from skin irritation, from essential oils being applied topically to the skin, or even worse, swallowed. Certain citrus oils can make our skin sensitive to sunlight, though less of a problem in France, evidently, where they're known to stick them where the sun doesn't shine. The USDA recently removed their online antioxidant database of foods, concerned that ORAC values were routinely misused by food and dietary supplement manufacturing companies to promote their products. Supplement manufacturers were getting into my ORAC is bigger than your ORAC pissing contest, comparing their pills to the antioxidant superfood du jour like blueberries. And we know there's lots of bioactive compounds in whole plant foods that may help prevent and ameliorate chronic diseases in ways that have nothing to do with their antioxidant power. So I understand their decision. So should we just eat lots of whole, healthy plant foods and not worry about which ones necessarily have more antioxidants? Or does one's dietary antioxidant intake matter? We have some new data to help answer that question. Dietary total antioxidant capacity and the risk of stomach cancer, the world's second leading cancer killer. 500,000 people studied, and dietary antioxidant capacity intake from different sources of plant foods was associated with a reduction in risk. Note they say dietary intake. They're not talking about supplements. Not only do antioxidant pills not seem to help, they seem to increase overall mortality. That's like paying to live a shorter life. Just giving high doses of isolated vitamins may cause disturbances in our body's own natural antioxidant network. There's hundreds of different antioxidants in plant foods. They don't act in isolation, they work synergistically. Mother Nature cannot be trapped in a bottle. Similar results were recently reported with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The more ORAC units in food we eat per day, the lower our cancer risk may drop. Though antioxidants are not greens, we're particularly protective. Look at that. Going from eating like one serving of green leafy vegetables per week to more like a serving per day may cut our odds of lymphoma in half. Should we be worried about antioxidant intake during cancer treatment, since that's how most chemo drugs work, by creating free radicals? According to some of the latest reviews, there's no evidence of antioxidant interference with chemotherapy, and in fact, they may actually improve treatment response and patient survival. The total antioxidant capacity of our diet may also be protective against stroke, in contradiction to all the pill studies that failed to show benefit. But what they did in this study was to take into account all antioxidants present in actual food in the diet, including thousands of compounds and doses obtained from a usual diet, not one or two in high doses in pill form. Stroke is the world's leading cause of death after heart disease. The buildup of oxidized fat is considered the hallmark of fatty streak formation, the earliest manifestation of atherosclerotic plaques. Yes, the oxidation of fat can happen outside the body every time we cook it, but oxidized fats are not only formed in foods, but may also be generated during digestion, especially in stomach acid. Our stomach may be like a bioreactor for the oxidation of high-fat, cholesterol-rich foods. See, muscle foods contain large amounts of endogenous catalysts, which accelerate fat oxidation. As poultry sits in our stomach, the oxidation may build up minute by minute. See, chickens are bled of only about half their blood, and the remaining residual can be a powerful promoter of fat oxidation. So there are those in the industry advocating an additional decapitation step to reduce all that oxidation. But if oxidation is the problem, antioxidants may be part of the solution. Total antioxidant capacity from diet and risk of heart attack. Well, we know antioxidant pills don't work, while extensive experimental data have revealed a central role for oxidative stress in the stiffening of our arteries and suggested a potential role for antioxidant treatment in cardiovascular disease. Experimental data has not translated into clinical benefit. Most antioxidant vitamin trials have failed to reduce heart disease and death, and may in fact even be detrimental. As a result, some have even questioned the supposed central role of oxidative stress in the disease process, described as a critical blow to the whole free radical theory of aging, the fact that pills didn't work. But high-dose single antioxidant supplements are not a good substitute for the very complex antioxidant network of thousands of compounds in foods, present at concentrations far below those used in the pill trials. No one had ever looked at the overall effect of the complex antioxidant network in diet in relation to our leading killer, coronary heart disease, until now. The total antioxidant capacity measures in one single value the free radical reducing capacity of all antioxidants present in foods and all the synergistic effects. And in this large prospective population-based cohort study, they observed that higher total antioxidant capacity of diet was associated with lower risk of incident heart attack in a dose-response manner, meaning potentially the more high antioxidant plant foods in our diet, the better. We know smoke inhalation isn't good for us. What about smoke ingestion? Decades ago, smoke flavorings were tested to see if they caused DNA mutations in bacteria, and the test was negative. Even as more and more smoke flavoring was added, the DNA mutation rate remained about the same. But the fact that something is not mutagenic in bacteria has little predictive value for its effect on human cells. So a group at MIT tested a hickory smoke flavoring they bought at the store against two types of human white blood cells. Unlike the bacteria, the mutation rate shot up as more and more liquid smoke was added. But there's little evidence that mutagenic activity in a particular human cell line is more closely related to human health risk than is mutagenic activity in bacteria. In other words, just because liquid smoke causes DNA mutations in human cells in a petri dish doesn't mean that it does the same thing within the human body. Damaging DNA is just one of many ways chemicals can be toxic to cells. A decade later, researchers tested to see what effect liquid smoke had on overall cell viability. If you drip water on cells, nothing happens. They keep powering away at around 100% survival. But drip on more and more wood fire smoke, and you can start killing some of the cells off. Cigarette smoke is more toxic. But 3 out of 4 of the brands of liquid smoke they bought at the supermarket killed off even more cells, leading them to conclude that the cytotoxic potential of some commercial smoke flavorings is greater than that of liquid cigarette smoke, a finding they no doubt celebrated, given that the researchers were paid employees of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Unfortunately, they didn't name names of the offending brands. That's one of the reasons I was so excited about this new study, where they tested and named 15 different brands of liquid smoke. This maximum response they were measuring was what's called p53 activation. p53 is a protein we make, illustrated here in pink and red, that binds to our DNA, shown in blue. It activates our DNA repair enzyme, so a big p53 response might be indicative of a lot of DNA damage. And a few of the liquid smoke flavorings activated p53 almost as much as a chemotherapy drug like etoposide, whose whole purpose is to break DNA strands. Other flavorings didn't seem as bad, though there was a hickory smoke powder that ranked pretty high, as did the fish sauce, though smoked paprika didn't register at all. The p53 activating property in liquid smoke was eliminated by standard baking conditions, so if we bake something with liquid smoke for long enough, it should eliminate this effect, though just boiling, even for an hour, or slow cooking didn't appear to work. They conclude, if the DNA-damaging activities of liquid smoke were thought to be deleterious, it might be possible to replace liquid smoke with other, safer, smoky substances. Why do they say if thought to be deleterious? That's because they're not directly measuring DNA damage. Remember, they're measuring p53 activation, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. p53 is considered guardian of our genome, guardian of our DNA. It's considered a tumor suppressor gene, because it helps repair our DNA. So if something boosts the activity of p53, is that good or bad? It's like the broccoli story. Cruciferous vegetables dramatically boost our liver's detoxifying enzymes. Is this because our body sees broccoli as toxic and is trying to get rid of it quicker? Well, either way, the end result from broccoli is good, lower cancer risk. It may be a biological phenomenon known as hormesis. That which doesn't kill us may make us stronger. Like exercise is a stress on the body, but in the right amount can make us healthier in the long run. So for example, teas and coffees cause p53 activation as well, but their consumption is associated with lower cancer risk. So it's hard to know what to make of that smoke-flavoring p53 data. Due to limitations of the available tests, it's hard to calculate the genotoxic potential of liquid smoke, or any other food for that matter. A better approach may be to just analyze liquid smoke for known carcinogens, chemicals that we know cause cancer. This was first attempted back in 1971. One of the 7 liquid smoke flavors they tested contained a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon known to be cancer-causing. But there's a bunch of similar carcinogens that they didn't test for. A later study tested across the board, looking specifically at 5 different carcinogens in retail liquid smoke seasonings. The recommended daily upper safety limit for these carcinogens is 47. Hickory smoke flavoring only has 0.8 per teaspoon, so you'd have to drink 3 bottles a day to bump up against the limit, and mesquite liquid smoke only 1.1. Turns out that most of these carcinogens in smoke are fat-soluble, And so when you make a water-based solution like liquid smoke, you capture the smoke flavor compounds without capturing most of the smoke cancer compounds. The only time you really need to worry is eating smoked foods directly exposed to actual smoke. For example, smoked ham comes up to here, and smoked turkey breast up to here. So one sandwich, and we may be halfway to the limit, but one serving of barbecued chicken takes us over the top. Less than a single drumstick, and we may nearly double our daily allotment of these carcinogens. Nothing, however, is as bad as fish. Smoked herring, 140. And we have to shrink down the graph to fit the worst of the worst. Smoked salmon. One bagel with lox could take us 10 times over the limit. The so-called meat glue enzyme, transglutaminase, is used by the industry to add value by gluing together smaller scraps into a larger chunk. And not just to make fake steak. The American Meat Institute estimates it's used in about 8 million pounds of meat every year in the United States. It can be used to cross-link pieces of any type of meat, fish, or meat product, hence can be used to produce large chunks of virtually intact-looking meat or fish out of small meat or fish cuttings. In fact, when these researchers actually tested for it in 20 samples of meat from the supermarket, they only found meat glue in salmon and turkey. I mean, how else are you going to get an improvement in gelling properties of minced lizard fish? Where does meat glue come from? For decades, the sole commercial source of transglutaminase was from the livers of guinea pigs. Now it can be sourced much cheaper. However, the future of meat glue remains uncertain because of, as meat scientists describe, communication difficulties. One of the reasons the industry is so excited about this stuff is because using meat glue enzymes, restructured meat can be made from underutilized portions of the carcasses. For example, you can get away with adding up to 5% tendons, and some people can't even tell the difference. This has raised food safety concerns, though. There's a risk that otherwise discarded leftovers of questionable microbial quality could find their way into the reconstituted meat. You can actually take a microscope and see introduced E. coli 015787 along the glue lines where meat pieces were enzymatically attached, which shows that the restructuring process can translocate fecal matter surface contamination into the interior of the meat. Furthermore, people who have problems with gluten may develop problems when ingesting meat treated with the meat glue enzyme, since it functions as an autoantigen capable of inducing an autoimmune reaction. A plant-based diet is thought to have played a significant role in human evolution, and the consumption of whole plant foods and even just extracts has repeatedly been associated with decreased risk of aging-related diseases. And by healthy aging, I'm not talking preventing wrinkles. What about protecting our brain? Two of the most dreaded consequences of dementia with aging, problems moving around, and difficulty remembering things. Dementia robs older adults of their independence, control, identity. What can we do about it? Well, fruits and vegetables help reduce the risk of other chronic diseases. Might they work for brain diseases as well? There's been a proliferation of recent interest in plant polyphenols as agents in the treatment of dementia. There are 4,000 different kinds found ubiquitously in foods of plant origin, but berries are packed with them, possessing powerful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory properties. And there's a subset of a subset called anthocyanidins, natural blue-purple pigments, uniquely and specifically capable of both crossing the blood-brain barrier and localizing inside brain regions involved in learning and memory. And that's where we need it. The brain takes up less than 2% of the body weight, but may burn up to 50% of the body's fuel, creating a potential firestorm of free radicals. So maybe these brain-seeking phytonutrients in berries could fight oxidation, inflammation, and increase blood flow. So this raised a thought-provoking idea. Maybe a nutritional intervention with blueberries may be beneficial in forestalling or even reversing the neurological changes associated with aging. So did researchers give blueberries to people and see what happened? No, as I noted in an earlier video, they gave blueberries to rats. It would be a a decade before the first human trial. But it worked. Blueberry supplementation improves memory in older adults, suggesting that consistent supplementation with blueberries may offer an approach to forestall or mitigate brain degeneration with age. What other blue-purple foods can we try? Concord grape juice had a similar benefit, improving verbal learning, suggesting that supplementation with purple grape juice may enhance cognitive function in older adults with early memory decline. Why use juice and not whole Concord grapes? Because then you couldn't design a placebo that looked and tasted exactly the same to rule out the very real and powerful placebo effect. And also because it was funded by the Welch's Grape Juice Company. This effect was confirmed, though, in a follow-up study showing for the first time an increase in neural activation in parts of our brain associated with memory using functional MRI scans. But this brain scan study was tiny, just 4 people in each group, and same problem with the blueberry study. Right? It just had 9 people in it. Why haven't large population-based studies been done? Because we haven't had good databases on where these phytonutrients are found. We know how much vitamin C is in a blueberry, but not how much cyanidin, until now. The Harvard Nurses' Health Study followed the cognitive function of more than 16,000 women for years and found that higher long-term consumption of berries was associated with significantly slower rates of cognitive decline in this cohort of older women, even after careful consideration of confounding by socioeconomic status, meaning even after taking into account the fact that rich people eat more berries. The first population-based evidence that greater intakes of blueberries and strawberries were highly associated with slower rates of cognitive decline, and not just by a little bit. The magnitude of associations were equivalent to the cognitive difference that one might observe in women up to 2.5 years apart in age. In other words, women with higher intake of berries appeared to have delayed cognitive aging by as much as 2.5 years. Why not just take some kind of anthocyanidin supplement? Because there hasn't been a single study that found any kind of cognitive benefit just giving these single phytonutrients. In fact, the opposite. Whole blueberries appear to be more effective than individual components, showing that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. These findings potentially have substantial public health implications, as increasing berry intake represents a fairly simple dietary modification to test in older adults for maintaining brain function. In my video, Preventing Childhood Allergies, I noted a study in Japan that found a higher maternal intake of meat during pregnancy was significantly associated with about 3 times the odds of both suspected and physician-diagnosed eczema. They suggested that certain components of meat may affect the fetal immune system, but what about the moms themselves? Seasonal allergies have exploded in Japan in the past few decades, starting with the first reported case in 1964, now affecting millions every year. We've seen rising prevalence of allergic diseases around the industrialized world in past decades, but perhaps nothing quite this dramatic. Researchers suggested profound changes in the Japanese diet may have played a role. Over the latter half century, total meat, fish, and milk intake rose hundreds of % in Japan, so researchers decided to look into dietary meat and fat intake and the prevalence of these seasonal pollen allergies. No association with overall fat, but higher meat intake was associated significantly with an increased prevalence of disease. So maybe it was the saturated fat? No, that didn't seem to be it. So what other constituents in meat may be to blame? Well, there are the cooked meat carcinogens, the heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and nitrosamines, but who knows? This new review, however, raised an intriguing possibility. There's a class of industrial pollutants, called alkyl phenols, recognized as common toxic endocrine-disrupting chemicals that tend to accumulate in the human body and may be associated with the adverse effects of allergic diseases. A variety of studies have shown how they may exacerbate allergen-induced inflammation, suggesting that alkyl phenol exposure may influence the onset, progression, and severity of allergic diseases. These toxic xenoestrogens can be found in human breast milk, stored up in our body fat, coursing through our urine, our bloodstream, and even the umbilical cord blood going to our babies. How did it get there? How do people get exposed? through contaminated food. It all goes back to a famous study about the reduction of penis size and testosterone levels in alligators living in a contaminated environment. I don't know what you all do for a day job, but these researchers observed that a population of juvenile alligators living in one lake in Florida exhibited a significantly smaller penis size and lower blood concentrations of testosterone compared to animals on some different lake. The most important difference between the two lakes was that Lake Stubby was fed by relatively polluted waters. They attributed the short penis phenomenon to estrogen-mimicking xenoestrogenic environmental metabolites of DDT that still pollute the Earth. This seminal work introduced the concept that endocrine disruptors, environmental xenoestrogens, might result in feminization of exposed male animals, and that's just the shriveled tip of the iceberg. Since then, endocrine-disrupting chemicals have been implicated in the dramatic rise over the last 50 years of diseases like breast cancer, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, diabetes, obesity, decreased fertility, such as dropping normal sperm counts. Not to mention genital birth defects, such as penile malformations, preterm birth, neurobehavioral disorders in children linked to thyroid disruption, and earlier breast development in young girls. Because genes do not change fast enough to explain these increases, environmental causes must be involved. Since our greatest exposure to the environment is through our gut, it's no surprise that our greatest exposure to these endocrine-disrupting chemicals is through diet. But which foods? I'll cover that next. There are many classes of endocrine-disrupting industrial pollutants. Concern about the alkylphenols first surfaced decades ago when a group at Tufts observed an excessive proliferation of human breast cancer cells in certain types of plastic containers, something you'd normally only see if the cells were exposed to some type of estrogen. They identified an alkylphenol as the culprit, leaching from the plastic, causing the estrogen-like properties when tested in the human breast tumor cells. That's not good, so countries in Europe started banning and restricting uses of these chemicals, but the US EPA has been slow to respond. 500,000 tons of these chemicals continue to be spewed out into the environment every year, so much so now that they just come down in the rain and then accumulate up the food chain. I talked about the seasonal allergy epidemic in Japan. Where in the Japanese food supply can you find these potentially allergy-exacerbating endocrine disruptors? Predominantly chicken, and especially fish. Water animals and birds concentrate these compounds to levels several thousands of times greater than those in the environment, because these are fat-soluble chemicals. Therefore, they can easily contaminate foods of animal origin, which are thought to represent the most important source of human exposure to many organic pollutants, not just the alkylphenols. This group also found fish was the worst. Which type of fish? Anchovies and mackerel were the worst in this study, and salmon and cod in this study. In fact, salmon was the only food found contaminated with nonylphenol diethoxylate, which is even more potent than regular nonylphenol. And levels of contamination in fish were just the kind of concentrations that start to make breast cancer cells go crazy in vitro. These findings are consistent with the fact that seafood consumption has been associated with severe asthma, current and severe rhinoconjunctivitis, which is like seasonal pollen allergies, and current and severe eczema, an allergic-type disease of the skin, in adolescent populations around the globe. If these synthetic xenoestrogens are playing a role, what about natural phytoestrogens, like in soy foods? Turns out that in patients with asthma, consumption of a diet with moderate to high levels of soy phytoestrogens is associated with better lung function and better asthma control. So, if anything, it's more these chemical pollutants, which come down the rain, contaminate the plants, the soil, but then concentrate up the food chain in the fat of animals. And we're now like the ecosystem's peak predator, like the polar bear or bald eagle. Thankfully, there aren't many cannibals around anymore, though there is one group that continues to feed off human tissues. Alkylphenols have been found to concentrate in human breast milk, particularly in women who eat fish. The highest levels of these endocrine-disrupting pollutants were recorded in milk samples from mothers who said they ate fish at least twice a week, consistent with the fact that seafood consumption represents an important source of alkyl-phenol intake. And even these slightly elevated levels of endocrine disruptors in the milk of mothers with a seafood-rich diet may be associated with adverse effects on neurological development, fetal and postnatal growth, and memory functions in breastfed infants, because these contaminants may interfere with the endocrine or hormonal system. Or even worse, straight animal fats, such as chicken fat, lard, and tallow, which were considered cooking oils here, or fish oil. Consumption of fish oil capsules and processed fish products was associated with alkyl-phenol concentration in mother's milk, again thanks to bioaccumulation up the food chain. And then, of course, we recycle the leftover remains of farm animals into farm animal feed, and so the levels can get higher and higher in animal food products. As one commentator responded, yes, these pollutants contaminate human milk, but they contaminate cow's milk as well. We live in the same polluted world. In fact, infant formula was found to be over 5 times more contaminated. So breast is still best, absolutely. But these kinds of studies are important in order to provide good suggestions for food choices to nursing mothers, to prevent excess exposure to these pollutants in their infants. We can kind of cut out the middle fish and move lower down the food chain in hopes of decreasing our exposure to industrial toxins. 15 million pounds of food dyes are sold every year in the U.S. Why? Foods are artificially colored to make unattractive mixtures of basic ingredients and food additives acceptable to consumers. See, food colorings are added to countless processed food products to conceal the absence of fruits, vegetables, and other ingredients, and make the food appear better or of greater value than it actually is. Otherwise, cherry popsicles might actually look like they have no cherries in them. I've talked about the role of food dyes in causing ADH symptoms in kids, but what about their role in cancer? Due to cancer concerns, red dye number 1 was banned in 1961, red number 2 was banned in 1976, and then red number 4 was banned. What about red number 3, used today in everything from sausage to maraschino cherries? It was recently found to cause DNA damage in human liver cells in vitro, comparable to the damage caused by a chemotherapy drug whose whole purpose is to break down DNA. But red number 3 was found to influence children's behavior more than 30 years ago, and interfere with thyroid function over 40 years ago. Why is it still legal? This is an article from the New York Times about red number 3 published way back in 1985. Already by then, the FDA had postponed action on banning the dye 26 times, even with the acting commissioner of the FDA saying red number 3 was of greatest public health concern, imploring his agency to not knowingly allow continued exposure at high levels, in the case of red number 3, of the public to color additives that have clearly been shown to induce cancer. The credibility of the Department of Health and Human Services would suffer if decisions are not made soon on each of these color additives. That was written 30 years ago. At the end of the day, industry pressure won out. FDA scientists and FDA commissioners recommend that the additives be banned, but there's been tremendous pressure to delay the recommendations from being implemented. In 1990, concerned about cancer risk, the FDA banned the use of red number 3 in anything going on our skin, but it remained legal to continue to put it in anything going into our mouths. Now, the FDA said at the time that they were planning on stopping that too, and end all remaining uses of red number 3, lamenting that the cherries in 21st century fruit cocktail could well be light brown. That was 1990. Over 20 years later, it's still in our food supply. After all, the agency estimated that the lifetime risk of thyroid tumors in humans from red number 3 in food was at most 1 in 100,000. Based on today's U.S. population, that would indicate that red number 3 is causing cancer in about 3,000 people. It is estimated that tumors start around the age of 20, yet detection of cancer is normally around the age of 50 or later, thus it takes cancer decades to incubate. Why does it take so long? Recent studies indicate that in any given type of cancer, hundreds of different genes must be modified to change a normal cell into a cancer cell. Although cancers are characterized by the dysregulation of cell signaling pathways at multiple steps, most current anti-cancer therapies involve the modulation of a single target. Chemotherapy has gotten incredibly specific, but the ineffectiveness, lack of safety, high cost of these mono-targeted therapies have led to real disappointment, and drug companies are now trying to develop chemo drugs that take a more multi-targeted approach. As a result, many pharmaceutical companies are increasingly interested in developing multi-targeted therapies. Many plant-based products, however, accomplish multi-targeting naturally, and in addition are inexpensive and safe compared to drugs. However, because drug companies are not usually able to secure intellectual property rights to plants, the development of plant-based anti-cancer therapies has not been prioritized. They may work better for all we know, they may be safer, they may actually be safe, period. If you were going to choose one plant-based product to start testing, one might choose curcumin, the pigment in the spice turmeric, the reason curry powder looks yellow. Well, before you start throwing money at research, you might want to start asking some basic questions, like do populations that eat a lot of turmeric have lower cancer rates? The incidence of cancer does appear to be significantly lower in regions where turmeric is heavily consumed. Population-based data indicate that some extremely common cancers in the Western world are much less prevalent in regions where turmeric is widely consumed in the diet. For example, overall cancer rates are much lower in India than in Western countries. Much lower. U.S. men get 23 times more prostate cancer than men in India. Americans get between 8 and 14 times the rate of melanoma, 10 to 11 times more colorectal cancer, 9 times more endometrial cancer, 7 to 17 times more lung cancer, 7 to 8 times more bladder cancer, 5 times more breast cancer, and 9 to 12 times more kidney cancer. This is not like 5, 10, or 20% more, but times more, so hundreds of percent more breast cancer, thousands of percent more prostate cancer. Differences even greater than some of those found in the China study. Because Indians account for 1/6 of the world's population and have some of the highest spice consumption in the world, epidemiologic studies in this country have great potential for improving our understanding of the relationship between diet and cancer. Of course, it may not be the spices. Several dietary factors may contribute to the low overall rate of cancer in India. Among them, a relatively low intake of meat, a mostly plant-based diet, in addition to the high intake of spices. 40% of Indians are vegetarians, and even the ones that do eat meat don't eat a lot. And it's not only what they don't eat, but what they do. India is one of the largest producers and consumers of fresh fruits and vegetables. And they eat a lot of pulses, meaning legumes, beans, chickpeas, and lentils. And it's not just turmeric. They eat a wide variety of spices, which constitute, by weight, the most antioxidant-packed class of foods in the world. Population studies can't prove a correlation between dietary turmeric and decreased cancer risk, but certainly inspired a bunch of research. So far, curcumin has been tested against a variety of human cancers, including colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, breast, prostate, multiple myeloma, lung cancer, and head and neck cancer for both prevention and treatment. We'll look at some of that research next. We are increasingly aware of plant-derived substances that act as chemopreventive agents, substances that help prevent cancer, as opposed to chemotherapy, substances aimed at treating cancer. These substances are not only inexpensive, they're easily available, have no or limited toxicity. Since 1987, the National Cancer Institute has tested more than 1,000 different potential agents for chemopreventive activity, of which only a few dozen were moved to clinical trials. Curcumin, present in the Indian spice turmeric, which is used in curry powder, is one such agent that is currently under clinical investigation for cancer chemoprevention. According to their mode of action, chemopreventive agents are classified into different subgroups. There's the anti-proliferatives, antioxidants, or carcinogen blockers. Curcumin belongs to all three, given its multiple mechanisms of action. Curcumin appears to play a role helping to block every stage of cancer transformation, proliferation, and invasion. It may even help before carcinogens even get to our cells. A study back in '87 investigated the effects of curcumin on the mutagenicity, the DNA mutating ability of several toxins, and they found that curcumin was an effective anti-mutagen against several environmental and standard mutagenic and cancer-causing substances. But this was in vitro, from the Latin meaning in glass, meaning in a test tube or petri dish. What about in people? Well, it's not like you can take a group of people and expose them to some nasty carcinogen just so you can give half of them turmeric and see what happens. Well, you could wait until some toxic waste spill happens or nuclear accident, but otherwise you're not going to find people who would voluntarily expose themselves to carcinogens. Unless smokers. We can just test it on smokers. They've got carcinogens coursing through their veins every day. If you take some smokers, have them pee on some bacteria, this is the number of DNA mutations that arise. Remember, all life is encoded by DNA, whether bacteria, banana, or bunny rabbit. It's easier, though, when measuring urinary mutagens to just pee on some bacteria. The urine of non-smokers caused far fewer DNA mutations. It makes sense. They have fewer toxins running through their system. And if you have the smokers eat turmeric for a month, have the non-smokers eat turmeric for a month, nothing really happens. All right. What if you do the same for smokers, though? 15 days later, they're down to here. 30 days, they're down to here. Right. And this is not some concentrated curcumin supplement. This is just plain turmeric, like you'd buy at the store, and less than a teaspoon a day, indicating that dietary turmeric is an effective anti-mutagen. You'll note, though, on this graph, there's an even more effective anti-mutagen: not smoking. Even eating turmeric for a month, the DNA-damaging power of smoker pee exceeded that of non-smokers. The anti-cancer effects of the turmeric pigment curcumin extend well beyond its ability to block carcinogens. The anti-cancer effect of curcumin mainly results from the multitude of ways it regulates programmed cell death. It's estimated that the human body consists of 10 or so trillion cells. That's a million. Almost all these cells get turned over within approximately 100 days. We're like a new person every 3 months. We reinvent ourselves physically. And since we're just made up of 3 things, air, water, and food, those are the only inputs. We are what we eat, literally, physically. In a sense, our body has to rebuild itself every 3 months with the building materials we deliver to it through our stomach. Right? Our mouths are like the access road to the continual construction site to our body. Trucks roll in 3 times a day. What do we want them to deliver? Some shoddy, cheap stuff we scrounged around for or bought at the discount outlets that's just going to fall apart? Or do we want to build our foundation solid? Right? We are each walking around inside the greatest known architectural structures in the universe. Let's not ruin such grand blueprints by consuming junk. Anyway, we only own the biological real estate we're born with, so if we need to rebuild every 3 months, we also need a wrecking crew. Right? If we're replacing 10 trillion every 100 days, that means we have to kill off like 100 billion cells every day, normally, out with the old, in with the new. We do that primarily through a process called apoptosis, pre-programmed cell death, from the Greek tosis meaning falling, and apo meaning away from. So it's our cells falling away from our body. For example, we all used to have webbed fingers and toes, literally each one of us in the womb until about 4 months. Then apoptosis kicks in, and the cells in the webbing in between kill themselves off to separate our fingers. Some cells in our body overstay their welcome, though, like cancer cells. They don't die when they're supposed to, by somehow turning off their suicide genes. What can we do about it? Well, one of the ways curry kills cancer cells is by reprogramming the self-destruct mechanism back into cancer cells. Let me just run through one of these pathways, just so you can see the complexity. FAST is a so-called death receptor, which activates the FAST-associated death domain, along with death receptor 5 and death receptor 4. FAD then activates caspase-8, which ignites the death machine and kills the cell. Where does curry powder fit into all this? In cancer cells, curcumin, the pigment in the spice turmeric that makes curry powder yellow, upregulates and activates death receptors, as has been demonstrated in human kidney cancer cells, as well as skin cancer and nose and throat cancer. It can also activate the death machine directly, as has been shown in lung cancer and colon cancer. Caspases are so-called executioner enzymes that, when activated, destroy the cancer cell from within by chopping up proteins left and right, kind of death by 1,000 cuts. And that's just one pathway. Here's all the other ways curcumin can affect apoptosis, and here's all the different types of cancer cells curcumin can kill. But it tends to leave normal cells alone, for reasons that are not fully understood. Overall, this review showed that curcumin can kill a wide variety of tumor cell types through diverse mechanisms, and it's because curcumin can affect numerous mechanisms of cell death at the same time, it's possible that cancer cells may not easily develop resistance to curcumin-induced cell death, like they do to most chemotherapy. Furthermore, its ability to kill tumor cells and not normal cells makes curcumin an attractive candidate. For supper? Can't make money on some spice you can buy anywhere. An attractive candidate for drug development. We've known increased nut consumption has been associated with a reduced risk of major chronic diseases, including heart disease and diabetes. But do those who eat nuts actually live longer lives? Clinical trials have shown nuts help lower cholesterol and oxidation and improve our arterial function and blood sugar levels, but does all this translate into greater longevity? Researchers at Harvard examined the association between nut consumption and subsequent mortality of over 100,000 people followed for decades. In that time, tens of thousands died, but those that ate nuts every day lived significantly longer. Daily nut consumers had fewer cancer deaths, heart disease deaths, and fewer deaths from respiratory disease. And this was after controlling for other lifestyle factors, so nut consumers lived significantly longer whether they were older or younger, fat or skinny, whether they exercised more or smoked, drank, or ate other foods that may affect mortality. But nuts are so filled with fat, there may be a concern that frequent nut consumption can result in weight gain. However, that's not what they found, and in fact other studies have associated nut consumption with a slimmer waist, less weight gain, lower risk of obesity. If you look at all the studies put together, it's pretty much a wash. Diets enriched with nuts do not seem to affect body weight, body mass index, or waist circumference much at all. Just for a visual, this is one of the most recent such studies in which subjects were told to add to their diets either 0, 70, or 120 pistachios to their daily diet as quite an afternoon snack every day for 3 months, and the results looked like this. You can't even tell which line is which, whether they're eating no nuts or over 100 a day. Hence it appears the incorporation of nuts, about 1 or 2 small handfuls a day, would be advisable to ensure various health benefits without the risk of body weight gain. And what was nice about this review is that there was no apparent ties to the nut industry. How nuts do we have to go? Not much. Just a few servings a week may boost our lifespan and lower cancer rates, but it appears we have to keep it up. In the Predimed study, when longtime nut eaters were told to cut down on eating nuts or choose extra virgin olive oil, within 5 years they apparently lost much of their longevity benefit. Only the group that started out eating nuts and continued to eat at least the same amount of nuts had the significant survival advantage. People going on low-carb diets may not see a rise in their cholesterol levels. How is that possible? Because weight loss by any means can drop our cholesterol. We could go on an all-Twinkie diet and lower our cholesterol if we were unable to eat the dozen daily Twinkies necessary to maintain our weight. That's why a good cocaine habit can lower cholesterol. Chemotherapy can drop cholesterol like a rock. Tuberculosis can work wonders on one's waistline. Anything that drops our weight can drop our cholesterol, but the goal isn't to fit into a skinnier casket. The reason we care about cardiovascular risk factors like cholesterol is because we care about cardiovascular risk, the health of our arteries. Well, now we have studies that have measured the impact of low-carb diets on arteries directly, and a review of all the best studies done to date found that low-carb diets impair arterial function, as evidenced by a decrease in flow-mediated dilation, meaning low-carb diets effectively cripple people's arteries. And since the meta-analysis was published, another study found the same thing: dietary pattern characterized by high protein and fat but low carbohydrate associated with poorer peripheral small artery function, again measuring blood flow into people's limbs. Peripheral circulation is great, but what about circulation in the coronary arteries that feed our heart? There's only been one study ever done measuring actual blood flow to the heart muscles of people eating low-carb diets, and this is it. Dr. Richard Fleming, an accomplished nuclear cardiologist, enrolled 26 people into a comprehensive study of the effects of diet on cardiac function using the latest in nuclear imaging technology, so-called SPECT scans, enabling him to actually directly measure the blood flow within the coronary arteries. He then put them all on a healthy vegetarian diet, and a year later the scans were repeated. By that time, however, 10 of the patients had jumped ship onto the low-carb bandwagon. At first, I bet he was upset, but surely soon realized he had an unparalleled research opportunity dropped into his lap. Here he had extensive imaging on 10 people following a low-carb diet, and 16 following a healthy high-carb diet. What would their hearts look like at the end of the year? We can talk about risk factors all we want, but compared to the veg group, did the coronary heart disease of the patients following the Atkins-like diets improve, worsen, or stay the same? Those sticking to the vegetarian diet showed a reversal of their heart disease as expected. Their partially clogged arteries literally got cleaned out. They had 20% less atherosclerotic plaque in their arteries at the end of the year than at the beginning. What happened to those who abandoned the treatment diet and switched over to the low-carb diet? Their condition significantly worsened, 40 to 50% more artery clogging at the end of the year. Thanks to the kind generosity of Dr. Fleming, we can actually see the changes in blood flow for ourselves. Here are some representative heart scans. The yellow, and particularly red, represent blood flow through the coronary arteries to the heart muscle. This patient went on a plant-based diet, and coronary arteries opened right up, increasing blood flow. This person, however, started out with good flow, but after a year on a low-carb diet, significantly clogged down their arterial blood flow. This is the best science to date, demonstrating the threat of low-carb diets, not just measuring risk factors, but actual blood flow in people's hearts on different diets. Of course, the reason we care about cardiac blood flow is we don't want to die, and a meta-analysis was recently published that finally went ahead and measured the ultimate endpoint, death. And low-carb diets were associated with significantly higher risk of all-cause mortality, meaning low-carbers living a significantly shorter lifespan. Cancer prevention strongly acknowledges the importance of diet, as dietary factors are the most important environmental risk factors for cancer. Within recent years, a large number of naturally occurring health-enhancing substances of plant origin have been recognized to have beneficial effects on cancers, known as phytochemicals. Yes, beans, chickpeas, split peas, and lentils are packed with all sorts of nutrients we need, but the reason they may protect against several degenerative diseases may be due to non-nutritive compounds in plants, or even so-called anti-nutrient compounds like phytates. The reputation of phytate has had a roller coaster ride ever since its discovery. It has been undergone alternate eminence and infamy. What everyone can agree on, though, is that phytates, also known as phytic acid, is one of the most fascinating bioactive food compounds and is widely distributed in plant foods. In the U.S., colon cancer is the second leading cause of cancer death. But in some parts of the world, they've had just a tiny fraction of our rates, with the highest rates reported in Connecticut and the lowest in Kampala, Uganda. The famous surgeon Dr. Burkitt spent 24 years in Uganda, and most of the hospitals in Uganda he contacted had never even seen a case of colon cancer. Noting they live off diets centered around whole plant foods, he figured that maybe it was the fiber that was so protective. Studies like this, though, called that interpretation into question. Danes appear to have more colon cancer than Finns, yet Danes consume almost twice the dietary fiber. What else, then, could explain the low cancer rates among plant-based populations? Well, fiber isn't the only thing only found in whole plant foods missing from processed and animal foods. Maybe it's the phytate. Dietary phytate, rather than fiber per se, might be the most important variable governing the frequency of colon cancer. As we know, phytate is a powerful inhibitor of the iron-mediated production of hydroxyl radicals, a particularly dangerous type of free radical. So the standard American diet may be a double whammy: the heme iron in muscle meat, plus the lack of phytate in refined plant foods, to extinguish those iron radicals. This may account for what was found in the Adventist study. They found excess risk of cancer for higher intakes of both red meat and white meat, suggesting all meats contribute to colon cancer formation, about twice the risk for the red meat eaters, and 3 times the risk for those eating chicken and fish. But those eating meat could reduce their risk in 2 ways: by cutting down on meat, or by eating more beans, an excellent source of phytates. So it's not just how much meat we eat, but our kind of meat-to-vegetable ratio. Between the 2 extremes, high vegetable and low meat diets versus high meat and low vegetable diets, a risk ratio of about 8 appears to exist, sufficient to explain a substantial part of that international variation in the incidence of colorectal cancer. Those with the worst of both worlds, high meat and low vegetable, were at 8 times the risk. The recent observations on phytate as an anti-carcinogen have support from population-based studies which show lower incidence of cancer in populations consuming vegetarian-type diets. Because phytate is found in beans, grains, nuts, and seeds, the average daily intake of phytate in vegetarian diets is about twice that of those eating mixed diets of plant and animal foods. Dietary phytate has been reported to prevent kidney stone formation, protect against diabetes, dental cavities, heart disease, as well as against a variety of cancers. Do all these potentially beneficial effects sound too good to be true? I mean, are there other examples of compounds made by plants that can have benefits across multiple diseases? Yes, aspirin, for example, which is actually found throughout the plant kingdom, and may also account for some plant-based benefits. But of all the things phytates can do, the anti-cancer activity of phytic acid, also known as phytate, also known as IP6 or inositol hexaphosphate, is considered one of the most important beneficial activities. Dietary phytates are quickly absorbed from the digestive tract and rapidly taken up by cancer cells throughout the body, and has been shown to inhibit the growth of all tested cancerous cell lines. Phytates have been shown to inhibit the growth of human leukemia cells, colon cancer cells, both estrogen receptor positive and negative breast cancer cells, voice box cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, liver tumors, pancreatic, melanoma, and muscle cancers, all at the same time not affecting normal cells. Right? That's the most important expectation of a good anti-cancer agent, is for it to only affect cancerous cells and leave normal cells alone, and that's what phytates appear to do. Leukemia cells taken from cancer patients are killed by phytates. Normal bone marrow cells, however, are spared, which may explain why bean extract kill off colon cancer cells, but seem to leave normal colon cells alone. Both the in vivo and in vitro experiments have shown striking anti-cancer effects, demonstrated that phytate is a broad-spectrum anti-neoplastic agent, meaning anti-tumor agent across different cells and tissue systems. What are the mechanisms of action by which phytates battle cancer? How do phytates fight? How don't they fight? Look at this. Phytate targets cancer through multiple pathways, a combination of antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and immune-enhancing activities, detox, differentiation, anti-angiogenesis. In other words, phytate affects the principal pathways of malignancy, and not just some of them. Apparently phytate targets and acts on all of them. The antioxidative properties, one of the most impressive characteristics of phytate. In fact, that's why the meat industry adds phytates to meat, to prevent the oxidation of fat that begins the moment of slaughter. Besides affecting tumor cells directly, phytates can act on our immune functions by augmenting natural killer cell activity, the cells in our body that hunt down and dispose of cancer cells, as well as neutrophils, which help form our first line of defense, and then starving tumors as more of a last line of defense. Not only can phytates block the formation of new blood vessels that may be feeding tumors, they can disrupt preformed capillary tubes, indicating that phytates may not only help blockade tumors, but actively cut off existing supply lines. What's really remarkable about phytate is that, unlike other anti-cancer agents, it not only causes a reduction in cancer cell growth, but also what's called enhanced differentiation, reversion of the appearance of cancer cells back to that of normal, meaning it causes cancer cells to stop acting like cancer cells and go back to acting like normal cells. You can see this with colon cancer cells, for example. In the presence of phytates, human colon cancer cells mature to structurally and behaviorally resemble normal cells. And this has been demonstrated in leukemia cells, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and muscle cancer cells as well. So if the phytates in beans are so successful in preventing cancer and re-educating cancer cells, let's put them to the test. Colorectal cancer is the second leading cause of cancer death in the United States, and it arises from what are called neoplastic adenomatous polyps, meaning colon cancer starts out as a benign little bump called a polyp, and then grows into cancer that can eventually spread to other organs and kill us. So the National Cancer Institute funded the polyp prevention trial to determine the effects of a high-fiber, high-fruit and vegetable, low-fat diet. They found no significant associations between polyp formation and overall changes in fruit and vegetable consumption. However, those with the greatest increase in bean intake only had about a third of the odds of advanced polyps popping up. Yes, it could have been the fiber in the beans, but there's lots of fiber in fruits and vegetables too, so maybe it was the phytate. If the tumors do grow, though, they still need to spread. Tumor growth, invasion, and metastasis are multi-step processes that includes not just cell proliferation, but invasion through the surrounding tissue and migration through basement membranes to reach the bloodstream before the tumor can establish new proliferating colonies of cancer cells. The first step is to tunnel through the surrounding matrix, considered a critical event in tumor cell invasion. To do this, the cancer cells use a set of enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases, which is where phytates may come in. We know phytates inhibit cancer cell migration in vitro, and now perhaps we know why. They help block the ability of cancer cells to produce the tumor invasion enzyme in the first place, in both human colon cancer cells and human breast cancer. Thus, phytates could be used not only in the early promotion state of cancer, but also in the all stages of cancer progression. So what happens if you give phytates to breast cancer patients? Although a few case studies in which phytates were given in combination with chemotherapy clearly showed encouraging data, organized, controlled, randomized clinical studies were never organized. Until now. 14 women with invasive breast cancer divided into two randomized groups. One group got extra phytates, the other got placebo. At the end of 6 months, the phytate group had a better quality of life, significantly more functional, and fewer symptoms from the chemo, not getting the drop in immune cells and platelets one normally experiences. And what are the potential side effects of phytates? Less heart disease, less diabetes, fewer kidney stones. Because cancer development is such an extended process, can take decades to grow, we need cancer preventive agents that we can take long-term, and phytates, naturally occurring in beans, grains, nuts, and seeds, fit the bill. Although in the past concerns have been expressed regarding intake of foods high in phytates reducing the bioavailability of dietary minerals, recent studies demonstrate that this so-called anti-nutrient effect can be manifested only when large quantities of phytates are consumed in combination with a nutrient-poor diet. For example, there used to be concern that phytate consumption might lead to calcium deficiency, but in fact researchers discovered the opposite to be true, phytates instead protecting against osteoporosis. In essence, phytate has many characteristics of a vitamin, contrary to the established and unfortunately still existing dogma among nutritionists about its quote-unquote anti-nutrient role. Given the numerous health benefits, its participation in important intracellular biochemical pathways, normal physiological presence in our cells and tissues and blood, and the levels which fluctuate with intake, epidemiologic correlates of phytate deficiency with disease, and reversal of those conditions with adequate intake and safety, all strongly suggest for phytate's inclusion as an essential nutrient, perhaps a vitamin. Meanwhile, inclusion of phytates in our strategies for prevention and therapy of various ailments, cancer in particular, is warranted. Now, they're talking about trying out supplements, but of course, eating a healthy diet rich in phytates would always be a prudent thing to do. When he was a surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn published a controversial paper in the American Journal of Cardiology. Heart bypass operations carry significant risks, including the potential to cause further heart damage, stroke, brain dysfunction. Angioplasty isn't much better, also carrying significant mortality and morbidity, and often doesn't work in terms of decreasing risk of subsequent heart attack or death. So it seems we have an enormous paradox. The disease that is the leading killer of men and women in Western society, Western civilization, largely untreated. The benefits of the invasive procedures are at best temporary, with most patients eventually succumbing to their disease. In cancer, we call that palliative care, or we just kind of throw up our hands, throw in the towel, and give up actually trying to treat the disease. So why does this juggernaut of invasive procedures persist? Well, one reason is that performing surgical interventions has the potential for enormous financial reward. That's considered one of the barriers to the practice of preventive cardiology, adequate return. Diet and lifestyle interventions loses money for the physician. Although the practice of preventive cardiology is not as lucrative, this article was hoping to nudge cardiologists in that direction by appealing to less tangible benefits. Another barrier is doctors don't think patients want it. Physician surveys show that doctors often don't even bring up diet and lifestyle options, assuming the patients would prefer, for example, to be on cholesterol-lowering drugs every day for the rest of their lives. And that may be true for some, but it's up to the patient to decide. According to the official AMA Code of Medical Ethics, physicians are supposed to disclose all relevant medical information to patients. The patient's right to self-decision can be effectively exercised only if a patient possesses enough information to enable an informed choice. The physician's obligation is to present the medical facts accurately to the patient. For example, before starting someone at moderate risk on a cholesterol-lowering statin drug, a physician might ideally say something like, "You should know that for folks in your situation, the number of individuals who must be treated with a statin to prevent one death from a cardiovascular event such as a heart attack or stroke is generally between 60 and 100, which means if I treated 60 people in your position, one might benefit and 59 would not." As these numbers show, it's important for you to know that most of the people who take a statin will not benefit from doing so, and moreover that statins can have side effects such as muscle pain, liver damage, upset stomach, even in people who do not benefit from the medication. I'm giving you this information so you can weigh the risks and benefits of drugs versus diet, and then make an informed decision. Yet, how many physicians have these kinds of frank and open discussions with their patients? Non-disclosure of medical information by doctors, that kind of paternalism, is supposed to be a thing of the past. Right? Now physicians are supposed to honor informed consent, unless the patient's in a coma or something, or it's an emergency. But too many physicians continue to treat their patients as if they were unconscious. At the end of this long roundtable discussion on angioplasty and stents, the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Cardiology reminded the participants of an important fact to place it all in context. Atherosclerosis is due to high cholesterol, which is due to poor dietary choices, and so if we all existed on a plant-based diet, we would not have even needed this discussion.